Right, now let's bring in our panel to discuss this leadership change. We're joined by Pieter Bottelier, Senior Advisor at the Conference Board China Center for Economics and Business. And from Beijing, by current affairs commentator Einar Tangen. And of course, our reporter Nathan King is also back with us. So, Pieter, I'm going to start with you. What's your take on China's new leadership lineup in terms of how they're going to implement Xi Jinping's economic vision for China?
Well, significant parts of the lineup are not yet known. I'm thinking in particular about the presidency of the central bank. Mr. Zhou Zhaochuan has been the president since 2002 and is due to retire, but his successor will probably not be known until sometime in early next year, in March, when the NPC meets.
And Einar, let me bring you in now. Who are the standouts for you in terms of the new leadership that's been introduced?
Well, I don't think anybody in particular stands out. Really what it is as a team. You have great diversity. You have market reformers. You have people who worked in very rich provinces and was able to take them to the next level. But you also have people like Li Shanshu and others who were working in the poorest regions. And they're very, very acutely aware of the needs of them. So I think it's a collective thing, how they balance together.
Now, Nathan, how important is it that you have this leadership experience that spans Tier 1 cities, including Beijing and Shanghai, but then also some of the rural areas and the more remote regions? What does that experience bring to the table?
Yeah, Aaron touched on this just now, didn't he? But remember, targeted poverty alleviation, bringing all of China's society up together is a major theme of the first 5 years of General Secretary Xi, and it's going to be for the next 5 years. Between 60 and 70 million people out of poverty in the first 5 years, it's going to actually increase in pace. So as well as wanting the cities, the urban centers to continue to do well, more of a focus on bringing those along to be part of the China dream. We talk about that a lot, but that's very important. So targeted poverty alleviation projects that work in rural areas that are poor. For example, I was in Guizhou in August. That province has really turned itself around in terms of pilot projects, different ways of combating poverty. So those lessons that are learned, and remember, all these officials, including General Secretary Xi, all started at the county or provincial level, not in the big cities necessarily. All that experience gets brought to bear during the next 5 years as well. So is it important? Not only have we got balance in terms of reformers and free traders, but also a geographical and economic balance as well.
And Pieter, following up on that, as you mentioned, all these new leaders really have this grassroots experience. What do you think that brings to the table then, when you have some of these leaders with this first-hand view of what's happening with the economies, as well as the social issues in some of their provinces?
Well, I've been impressed by the quality of the economic team in China for some time. They're all very experienced. They've all been trained for their jobs for many years, sometimes decades. I think that tradition is likely to be continued. In response to your previous question, I should have mentioned the promotion to the Central Committee of Mr. Liu He. That's a significant development. There is a possibility now that Mr. Liu He, who is one of the most experienced economists in the top, will become a deputy premier type officer with very significant responsibilities for the economy.
And Einar, let me also get your take on this. This grassroots experience that they have, that real people forward, making people a priority. How do you think that's going to play out amongst the Chinese people?
Well, I think it plays out very well. I mean, in America, we have the war on terror, we have the war on poverty, we have war on everything, but we're not seeming to win many of them. In China, it's a very, very different. You know, what Nathan talked about, it's when you're saying that we're going to eradicate poverty, the question is how. And in China, that means 2 million government workers assembling 89 individual cases for individuals, families, and villages, and putting together a concrete plan to lift them out of poverty as defined by the United Nations, which is $1.92 US per day. So these are things that are very important. It's fine to have the sound bites to say we're going to do great things, but if you don't have that ability to understand how to get that done and the means, it turns out to be meaningless. And this is really where the Chinese government has shined. I mean, their ability to plan and execute in terms of their strategy and goals has been what the people are looking for on a consistent basis.
And Nathan, let me bring you in here. We saw that the leaders really do bring a variety of experience, especially when it comes to the economy. Are there any particular sectors or industries that you think could really benefit from having their expertise on board?
Well, we know what industries China's going to focus on. It's called Made in China 2030, and there's about 10 different areas where really you're going to see, not just, I'm not talking about poverty alleviation now, I'm talking about industries where there's going to be a sort of laser-like focus. And they are strategic industries, not just for China, but globally too. I'm talking about semiconductors, I'm talking about robotics, I'm talking about artificial intelligence. All these areas, China wants not just to be part of the conversation, they want to basically have national champions that can compete on a global level. And that is what part of when Xi Jinping was talking about economic reform, that's what he's talking about as well. And that's where a lot of some of the confusion perhaps about state-owned enterprises can be solved, because, you know, on the one hand they talk about the decisive hand of the market, and then the other about making the state-owned enterprises, SOEs, bigger, smarter. That's where this focus is, about creating national champions that can compete on a global scale as well as be innovative and deal in the global marketplace as well. It seems like a contradiction, but for China, they don't think so.
Now, Pieter, I do want to bring you back in. We know that it's interesting that the standing members started their political careers when China had just begun its opening up process back in 1978. What impact do you think that's going to have as China now begins this new era?
Well, time will tell. I know many of the current actors in the economic team, and they have indeed all been active, or most of them have been active since the late 70s or early 80s. And that's a major asset because China has historical knowledge, depths of experience, and institutional memory, which many countries don't have.
So, Einar, I'm going to start with you. We know that China continues to rise up the ranks when it comes to the ease of doing business, according to the World Bank. It's actually risen 13 spots since 2012. So what are some of the key policies China put in place to improve the overall business environment?
Well, a lot of it has to do with cutting red tape, the negative list that you mentioned that allows companies to go unhindered into areas that are not actually listed as prohibited, or at least where you have to get additional permissions. This has opened things up, but there are still people here who say, oh, well, it's not like that used to be. And that's part of the normalization process that's happening in China. If you come here, just remember, you will be competing in the marketplace. So bring something with you that makes sense. This is what China has been aiming for. It's, as I said, this normalization process. But China is the largest market in the world. This is a great opportunity to attach yourself early to a market that will continue to go. I mean, when Xi Jinping says, I'm bringing people out of poverty, you're going to have a middle-class nation, as defined by the UN, going just a few years from now. This tremendous opportunities.
And looking ahead to a few years from now, in terms of inbound investment, which sectors do you think are likely to see more foreign investment start to flow in?
Well, the sector that is crying out for more foreign investment and that has remained relatively closed, even though other sectors opened up completely, is the service sector. So it's very encouraging that President Xi Jinping, in his address to the 19th Party Congress, singled out the service sector as an area that would be further opened for foreign investment.
And Einar, what's your take on that, the role of the service sector in terms of China opening up?
Well, it's very, very important. I mean, there's two areas where China really needs to kind of bone up, and one of them is the service sector. These are areas where China does not have the experience. The other, of course, is they're, in addition to developing technology, they're looking for new one. Now, remember, China's goal here is to join the top ranks economically of the world. And this would have a profound impact on the shape of, things. What used to be a pyramid with a few nations at top would look more like a sandwich if China were to join the top ranks. And this is going to require a lot of change in thinking. This is one of the reasons they have the Belt and Road Initiative and how they're trying to spread this out and create new markets for themselves.
Now, Pieter, in terms of some of the ways that China has tried to open up to foreign investment, we've seen these pilot free trade zones. What are some of the lessons and experiences that China has learned so far from this?
Oh, incredibly important. The whole process of opening up really started in 1980 with the establishment of the initial 4 special economic zones, including Shenzhen and Zhuhai, Shantou and Xiamen, I believe. That process has evolved ever since that time. China is now much more open than most developing countries, but it still has some ways to go, particularly in the service sectors, as we already mentioned. But it has been an incredibly important part of the development policies since the early 80s. It's hard to imagine that China could have developed as fast and as comprehensively without the aid of very significant private and official foreign investment.
And Einar, what are some of the ways that foreign investors are really taking advantage of the opportunities that these free trade zones offer?
Well, to be truthful, I mean, it started off fairly slowly. I mean, the Chinese model is that they do a lot of planning, a lot of study. They'll start implementing a model. And that's what they had in Shanghai. So the first few years, they were still working out the bugs. Now you start to see a lot of companies who are moving in because they can put it into a context that fits their business, whether it's in the service sector or whether they're just probing to see what other opportunities there are. These are good launch points. And this is exactly what China has been doing. They really pioneered this whole area of creating these trade zones as economic engines for these different cities. I mean, when we talk about Shenzhen, you know, what you should keep in mind is it was created. And on one side, the government created the opportunity. It's kind of like making sure the soil is fertile and then watching the crops grow. So from the Chinese perspective, they carefully marry the economic opportunities to where they want them to be, where it makes the most sense. Very difficult from the Western notion that cities kind of evolve organically and then you just manage them.
Now, let's also look at this issue of trade disputes, Pieter, that seems to come up, and especially some of these trade remedy measures that we're seeing from the US and the EU. How can China better either negotiate or navigate with these disputes?
Well, things have changed completely as a result of China's membership in the WTO in 2001. That was an important breakthrough in China's relationship with major trading partners around the world. Ever since, China has become the world's largest exporter and is projected to become the world's largest importer. China has been a constructive partner in the WTO. It has been the subject of many complaints from other countries, but it has responded relatively positively to decisions by the Dispute Settlement Board in Geneva. I'm not a champion of the discussions that are currently being conducted in the United States about punishing China for its so-called alleged trade misbehavior. I believe much of that is based on misunderstanding, misconceptions. China obviously has a long way to go before it's a fully open economy, both for trade and for investment. The US is a much more open economy than China is at the present time. We should not lose sight of that. But if you compare China today with China 20 or 30 years ago, it's truly remarkable how much the country has opened up, both to investment and to trade.
So, Pieter, let's start with what stood out to you as the policy highlights from Xi Jinping's report in terms of further opening up China.
Well, that was very encouraging about his speech. I also would like to emphasize the importance of his Belt and Road Initiative as part of the further opening. But this is not opening into China, but China opening to the rest of the world. What's going on with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI as it is sometimes called, is hard to understand. It's so large, and the world has never seen anything like this before. In the opinion of some commentators, it is the most ambitious development project or plan ever presented. So it's extremely important. China had a big forum in Beijing in May, which was opened by the President Xi Jinping, which was the occasion for about 66 countries to participate in one way or another. Some 29 heads of state participated in this forum. Some 36 or 35 other countries were represented in some other ways, and all the major multilateral development banks and other international development institutions, including the World Bank and the IMF, the ADB in Manila, were all present at this major event. So as part of China's longer-term development strategy and opening up strategy, the BRI, as I call it, is an extremely important component.
Now, bringing you in, Einar, we know that One Belt, One Road was also included in the amended party constitution. How significant is that?
Well, I think it's very important. I mean, this is not something that's going away. You heard the numbers, $28 trillion in terms of needs, and right now there's just a drop in the bucket in there. You also heard the kind of projects that you mentioned, the kind of projects that they're pursuing. These are all human-based infrastructure that are going to improve lives and save money. Every time Manila floods, there are millions in losses. The economic disruption is there. By doing these kinds of projects, you know, China is really helping the outside world as it develops its own. The truth is that China is connected to the world. And the reason is that they need the resources. China is in 100th place in terms of per capita resources per person. So when you start looking at that, their need is there. The idea that, you know, if you had told me 10 years ago that China would emerge as the foremost champion of international trade and that they would be pushing forward the new idea, the next idea in world development, and that the U.S. would be on the opposite side of that, pushing protectionism, I would have said that's not possible. But it is possible, and it has happened today. And this is the new face of the world economics.
And Einar raises a good point. As you see that China is really taking the lead when it comes to globalization, you also have some of these more protectionist stances that are coming about. So in terms of this rising protectionism, where does this role stand then?
The protectionism is a real threat in the world. It has become more serious after the global financial crisis of 2008. China has resisted pressures for greater protectionism, even though there is this danger lurking all the time. I see a risk in some of the current initiatives that have been launched by China regarding its industrial policies. The emphasis on the strong role of the state in the industrial sector, in the economy in general, entails the risk of greater protectionism. It hasn't happened so far, but there is that risk.
And Einar, what's your take on that in terms of also the industries that are going to be impacted the most by Belt and Road?
Well, I think if you look at it, I mean, there's a countervailing argument. China looks at it as that they're consolidating their SOEs and trying to make them more efficient in terms of their ability to deliver the kind of projects that we're talking about in infrastructure. I mean, China really is the builder of infrastructure to the world. If you look at roads, rail, nuclear, everything, most of it is being done by China simply because they can deliver very good things at a very reasonable price. Right. And given the dearth of money that's available, they need to push this along. In terms of how the industries that will be affected, yes, I don't think this is going to change. Xi has a very strong opinion that these SOEs are in fact necessary and they just need to be more efficient.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there, but a big thank you to all of our panelists tonight, Pieter Bottelier, Einar Tangen, and of course our reporters covering the 19th Party Congress for us in Beijing.